Every word that comes from Hitler's mouth is a lie. When he says peace, he means war. We will not be silent.
Brother and sister Hans and Sophie Schoell and their friend Christoph Probst were executed for treason on this day in 1943 in the German city of Munich. They were three members of the White Rose Resistance, an idealistic group of young friends who, through anonymous writings, tried to mobilize their fellow Germans to rise up against Hitler and the Nazi regime. Thank you for joining us today. I'm your host, historian Edna Friedberg, and I'd like to welcome our guest, my colleague and friend, historian Dr. Rebecca Erbelding. Good morning, Becky.
Good morning, Edna. Thanks for having me back.
Always glad to have you. Viewers, please share your questions for Becky in the comment section, and we'll get to as many as possible during the course of the live show. I'd like to start with two of the better-known members of the White Rose Resistance Group, Hans and Sophie Schoell. A viewer named Malik asked, what were Hans and Sophie like before the war? And Becky, I'm wondering, did anything about them suggest that they might do something bold later in life?
Not really. There's not really very much in their early years that would give us this impression. So Hans and Sophie grew up in the 1930s in Ulm, Germany, which was the same town where Einstein was born. They were 5 kids in the family, and they were pretty devout Protestants. Hans was 14 in 1933 when Hitler came to power, and Sophie was 11. And they both participated in Nazi youth activities as was expected and later mandated of all German children, and they were enthusiastic about it. Hans even rose to a leadership position in the Hitler Youth. But after a few years, he quit. And with his friends, Hans joined a different youth group, one that was based in scouting, and one that was later banned by the Nazi regime. And Sophie and their siblings joined too. And one of the things that was kind of unusual about the family, kind of a hint that we might get of their later resistance activities, is that their parents supported them. Their parents were not fans of the Nazis either. And in late 1937, 4 of the kids, including Hans and Sophie, who were teenagers at this point, they were arrested for being members of that illegal scout group. Hans was even kept in custody for weeks. So already in the 1930s, you see the Schoell children start to push against the Nazi regime.
So how did this kind of more gentle push, as you said, or rebellion evolve into more direct activism and dangerous activities?
Well, as they got older, as they grew into their later teens and early 20s, Hans and Sophie started to seek out books, books that had been banned by the Nazi regime, even reading the work of Jewish writers. And they found friends whom they could talk to about those books in secret. They discussed their love of music and art and philosophy and reading with these friends. And this is the group of friends that later developed into the resistance cell. They didn't want to just talk about resistance within their group. They were willing to take risks publicly to call attention to it.
So there's this group of friends, but let's give some context to it. What was happening in Germany during this period that influenced their thinking?
There are really 2 things at play here. There's the Holocaust and there's World War II. So we know that the persecution of German Jews wasn't secret, especially in the 1930s. So the future members of the White Rose would have seen the noose start to tighten around the Jews in their community little by little as they were growing up. They would have watched the violence in November 1938, known as Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, where Jewish neighbors were beaten and their businesses were destroyed. Like the scenes you can see here, the synagogue in the Schoell city of Ulm was destroyed. And after 1941, German Jews had to publicly wear a yellow star. So the members of the White Rose would have seen this happening too. And then, of course, there's World War II. World War II began in 1939 when Germany invaded Poland. And Germany successfully conquered a lot of territories. And Hans and some of his friends even participated in some of those invasions as members of the German military. But by 1942, they had grown skeptical of Nazi propaganda, and it was hard for them to understand what their generation was supposed to be fighting and dying for. And so they felt that Hitler and the Nazis were ruining the country that they loved.
Still, it's a pretty big leap, especially under a totalitarian regime, to go from feeling disillusioned or frustrated or angry to actually founding some kind of resistance cell. How do these friends become the White Rose?
In the summer of 1942, it really started with Hans and his friends. So in the summer of 1942, Hans and one of his friends and classmates at the University of Munich Medical School, Alexander Schmerel, started the White Rose movement. Members of their friend group were outraged that so many Germans were going along with Nazi policy, going along with the war, going along with whatever the Nazi leadership wanted. And the members of the White Rose thought their fellow Germans weren't really thinking about this. And so they wanted their fellow Germans to really step up, to think about this, and to take action. So they started to put their feelings into writing, which of course was a really dangerous thing to do.
I'd like to pause for a moment, Becky, to welcome viewers who are watching from around the country and around the world. Good morning to you in Dartmouth, Massachusetts, Columbus, Ohio, Waukegan, Illinois, Oxford, Mississippi, Birmingham, Alabama, and Katy, Texas. And also welcome to all of our international viewers who are watching from Toronto, Canada, from Denmark, from Australia, Brazil, and Germany. We're so glad to have you all here with us. Becky, we have a viewer question. Someone named Alex is asking why the group chose the name White Rose as their name or symbol. Can you shed any light on that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Alex. And we're really not sure. They weren't going to write down a lot of the planning information for their secret organization. So it was probably either chosen at random or because of the symbolism of the white rose as a sign of purity, or it might have been a literary reference from one of the books that Hans and Alexander were reading.
Okay, so thank you. We just sometimes don't know things, but have theories. So Becky, everyone involved in White Rose was aware that this was a dangerous affiliation to have. And the Nazis had deliberately created and cultivated an environment that would squelch dissent, that would encourage people to denounce their friends, denounce their family members. And while there were many Germans who quietly disagreed with the Nazis' radical policies, members of the White Rose did not keep their thoughts and their doubts and their anger to themselves. And eventually they reached thousands of people with their pleas to oppose the Nazis, but they started small. What did they do first?
Well, we have to remember that they couldn't text and they couldn't email, and they also needed to remain anonymous. So at first, Hans, with help from Alexander, began to type up multi-page letters like a manifesto, and you can see one of them on the screen here. These first letters reached only a small circle of people, only a few hundred were distributed. And in these first letters, the writers called on their fellow Germans to defy Hitler, and they declared that their country was headed for self-destruction under his watch. They relied on the books that they were reading and used very lofty language. They quoted philosophers and poets, and they urged their readers to resist the regime by sharing the leaflet with others and making additional copies. For example, in the third leaflet, Hans and Alexander wrote, "We must bring this monster of a state to an end as soon as possible." So it was really very, very dangerous things that they were doing.
And that's pretty dangerous and bold and direct language to use in this environment. Let's listen to their friend, a guy named George Wittgenstein, describe his initial shock at reading one of these letters when he's reflecting back years later.
Early in 1942, I received a leaflet of the White Rose in the mail. I was stunned that anybody would write and mail something like this. When a week or so later, 2 weeks, arrived the second one, it was very clear to me that the only person who could have written it would have been Hans Schoell. So I confronted him with that. He said yes. They were very romantic and just basically saying Germany has to wake up and has to shed the tyranny. It also said, and it's to the best of my knowledge now, whatever I read, is the only resistance group in Germany that told the German population about the extermination of Jews. Nobody else did.
So by this time, there were definitely rumors about the mass murder of Jews, and what the White Rose did by writing about it was to confront their fellow Germans in black and white, kind of saying out loud what might have only been whispers. And so in the second leaflet, as George said, they wrote about the murder of 300,000 Jews. They described it as the most terrifying crime against human dignity, a crime that is unparalleled in the entire history of mankind. But of course, we know that their numbers are wrong. And actually, by the end of 1942, more than 4 million Jews had been murdered, not 300,000. But it's still stunning that the members of the White Rose kind of call this out, even if their numbers aren't accurate.
It's also really striking in retrospect because so many Germans, average Germans after the war, claimed, "I didn't know, how could I have known?" And the words of the White Rose leaflet from that moment challenge that defense and undermine it. Now, Becky, so they're typing up these documents full of inflammatory and dangerous language, but how were they distributing them? Because it was very dangerous to do. So even distributing them, being caught with it, could be a cause for arrest.
Yeah, I mean, they're taking massive risks. First, you saw in the clip that George said he knew immediately that Hans was the author. And so right there, were there others who also knew that this was Hans and Alex's work? And second, they were operating at a time of the war where there was rationing, and anyone buying large quantities of anything would be suspect. And so they had to split up. They had to purchase small quantities of stamps and paper and envelopes in lots of different places so that they would have enough material to use. They finally obtained a hand crank copying machine, and they used all the supplies that they had gathered to make hundreds of copies, and then later thousands of copies. They mailed these copies to people that they knew at first, to professors, to friends, but also to strangers. They would find random names in the phone book and write to them. They even write in one of the leaflets, "We are sending these to random people," maybe as a way to help protect the people who received the leaflet. They got help from a network of like-minded friends of friends in cities, sometimes hundreds of miles away, who would mail things within their communities or even put things in phone booths, drop off leaflets in places where they might get picked up. And so they had a whole network of people who helped distribute these letters. So even though their efforts began in Munich, the White Rose leaflets eventually reached households across Germany.
So they're trying to tap into networks of people who might feel sympathetic to agitate them. It's really a growing campaign of agitation appealing to people's hearts and minds. Becky, I also want to welcome frequent viewers for us, 7th grade art students at Central Junior High in Kewanee, Illinois. We're so glad that you're here. And we have another viewer question. Someone named Tacey writes, "I'm curious about the reactions of the German people. Did they believe them?" I'm not sure which them they mean, but did they believe, or were they afraid to speak out, or were there some who were still believing Nazi propaganda?
I think some people who received the leaflets were just afraid. Even having a copy of a leaflet in your possession could get you into trouble. And so some people who received the leaflets or found the leaflets turned those copies into the Gestapo, the secret police. And of course, they began then an intensive search for whoever might be authoring these leaflets. Don't forget that rebellion of this sort inside Germany and inside German society was incredibly rare. So even among friends, even among families, people might have feared being reported if they spoke critically of the regime, even to someone that they had trusted. We know, for example, that in the fall of 1942, after Hans had begun writing these leaflets, his own father, Robert, was imprisoned for several months just for making a casual comment criticizing Hitler, a comment that was overheard, and he was then turned in. That had to demonstrate that the fact that his father was in prison had to demonstrate to Hans the danger of what they were doing. The White Rose Group was trying to start an internal revolution inside of Germany.
And another audience member named Janessa is asking, what inspired the White Rose members to continue their efforts? in the face of possible arrest and even death. So some members of the White Rose I know witnessed something actually that might help us to explain how they continued with their commitment and actually made their urge to resist feel even more compelling. What happened outside of Germany that fed their movement?
Well, after the first group of leaflets were written in the summer of 1942, Hans and Alex and George had to fulfill military requirements. And so in July 1942, they were actually sent to the Russian front to work as medics training soldiers. Just like other German men at the time, they had to contribute to the war effort. And you can see here Sophie bidding her brothers and her friends farewell at the train station. On the way to the Soviet Union, the boys actually spent a few days in German-occupied Warsaw. And they saw what life was like for Jews inside the Warsaw Ghetto, which was the walled-off section of the city where more than 400,000 Jews had been imprisoned in an area of only 1.3 square miles. Hans wrote to his mother about what he saw in the ghetto, and he said that he saw half-starved children sprawl in the streets and whimper for bread. This visit clearly had made a huge impression on them. The ghetto was overcrowded. It was ridden with disease. There was little food or clean water, and it was not uncommon to see people begging, dying, or even dead in the streets. And I kind of wonder whether they chose to visit the ghetto with potential future leaflets in mind. Maybe they were going to write about this. And while they were there, also, they heard about a large deportation of Jews. And we know that this was not just a rumor that they had overheard. Although they didn't see what was happening, we know that about 265,500 Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto were deported and murdered at the Treblinka killing center that summer.
So they're seeing these horrors and knowing that these are crimes that are being committed in the name of the German people without their direct knowledge or endorsement of it. But after this exposure to the German and brutality there in occupied Poland, what else did they see on the Eastern Front?
Well, they saw that Germany was losing the war. Hans and Alexander and George had been hearing, of course, German propaganda back in Germany saying, the war is going great. And they were really disturbed that they discovered that their leaders weren't acknowledging the reality and were instead lying to people back home. Alexander, in particular, had been born in Russia and spoke the language, so he could talk to captured Soviet soldiers and civilians about how the war was going from their perspective. And so he could learn a lot more information than the average German soldier. So when the students returned to the University of Munich in November, when they were done with their military service, they came back even more determined to challenge the Nazi regime and to share the reality of what they had seen.
And they're feeling their conviction that the German public was being duped, that they were not being told the truth about, as you said, the course of the war effort and also the kinds of things that the German government was doing elsewhere.
Exactly.
You mentioned, we just saw this photograph of them at the train station and Sophie Schoell, Hans's younger sister. Today, she's perhaps the more recognizable or widely celebrated face of the White Rose. When did she get involved with this resistance work?
Yeah, she's not involved actually at the beginning. But much like George, Sophie started to suspect that her brother was behind the illegal writings. And he finally admitted to her that he was. And so she then joined the group's resistance efforts. Like her brother, she was politically and morally opposed to the Nazis, but she also rejected the Nazis' expectations on women and on girls. While she was a student, a high-ranking Nazi visited the University of Munich in January 1943 and gave a speech urging female students to drop out and to return to their homes to become mothers because that was the proper place for a woman. And you can kind of see why Sophie would chafe at that. She wanted to get an education and she wanted to not only be a wife and a mother. But because of the limited expectations that the Nazis often had for women, Sophie was sometimes able to fly under the radar as a member of the White Rose. Like other members, she traveled to other cities to distribute copies of the leaflets, and she bought envelopes and paper and stamps. Even though she didn't write any of the leaflets, Sophie has perhaps become the most well-known member of the White Rose, as you said. And I think part of that is because of her bravery. And at a time when women and girls were not necessarily expected by their own society to be that brave.
Now, up to this point, we've really just been talking about a cadre of young people, of students. We know young people are often idealistic, but there was another person who joined the movement around this time who had a totally different profile. Tell us about a man named Kurt Huber.
Kurt Huber was a professor. He was a professor at the University of Munich. He was 50 years old. He taught philosophy and psychology and music, and he taught several members of the White Rose. He was a beloved professor, beloved by his students, and particularly ones who maybe privately did not like the Nazi regime, because Dr. Huber would weave into his lessons sarcastic remarks on forbidden topics, on books and authors, and he would do it with kind of a wink so that like-minded people would guess that he opposed the Nazi regime, but the people who supported the regime really couldn't prove that. And so Hans was particularly fond of him and approached him in November 1942 for advice on their resistance work.
And so how much influence did Professor Huber have on their activities?
Well, with his help, the messages grew more urgent. He even wrote some of them. The leaflets at this time, after the students come back from their military service and when Professor Huber joins them, they start to call on the German public to act, encouraging them to sabotage Germany's war machine, to stop contributing to the war effort. And at the same time, the White Rose students start painting forbidden signs like freedom and down with Hitler on the walls of the university and around the streets of Munich. They wanted passersby to see that resistance was possible and that there were people in their midst who were opposed to the Nazi regime. This, of course, ramped up the danger. It ramped up the Gestapo's attempts to search for them and to figure out who was behind the letters. But it also narrowed the search down. The secret police could kind of guess at that point that the culprits were probably students at the university.
And they're getting increasingly bold, some might say increasingly reckless as a result. And all told, the White Rose produced and distributed 6 leaflets with hundreds or then thousands of copies of each between June 1942 and February 1943. They were calling on the German people to rise up against Nazi oppression and tyranny, but they were not able to continue. What led to the end of their work? What happened?
Well, as you said, the group had taken some steps to avoid being caught, but they were taking even more risks. And on the morning of February 18th, 1943, Hans and Sophie Schoell decided to do something that was incredibly brazen and dangerous. Around 11 a.m., they arrived at the University of Munich with a red briefcase full of leaflets. And their plan was to leave stacks outside the lecture hall so that students would find them as they left class, kind of like they had with phone books, just leaving them in places to be discovered. And the brother and sister were getting nearly ready to leave when Sophie realized that she hadn't distributed all of the flyers. And so at the top of the stairs overlooking a courtyard, she just opened the suitcase and let the leaflets flutter down. And unfortunately, at that moment, she was spotted.
And who spotted them? What happened?
They were spotted by a university janitor. And the janitor was a very loyal Nazi Party member. He was in the courtyard when Sophie dropped the leaflets. And so he captured them and he called the authorities. Police searched them and found a large number of stamps and other incriminating materials that they happened to have on them. And so Hans and Sophie Schoell were the first members of the White Rose to be arrested.
And we were just having a look at their police mugshots from the time of their arrest. But it didn't end with them. They opened a door that would help to uncover more participation. What led to that? What did they have?
Well, in Hans's pocket, and I don't know why he would have had this, but in Hans's pocket was a draft leaflet written by Christoph Probst, who was another member of the White Rose. Christoph was unlike the other students in the group. He was also a student, and he was still in his 20s, like Alex and like the Schoells, but he was also married and he was a father. He had actually transferred from the University of Munich and he was living in Innsbruck at the time that Hans and Sophie were caught. His wife had just given birth to their third child just a month before his friends were arrested. But the Gestapo was able to track the draft letter that Hans was carrying to Christoph and arrested him the next day.
And I'm struck, we're seeing his mugshot as well, but also seeing that lovely photograph, family photograph of him as a young father with his child. Very often we see not only in the White Rose, but also, for example, in Jewish ghettos in occupied territory, resistance movements are often led by young people, people without dependence, people with less to lose, or without people who are relying on them, and therefore have more freedom to take risks, to put themselves in danger, not feeling like they're dragging others along with them. But that was not the case, unfortunately, for Christoph. So how did the German judicial system then treat these people who were seen as traitors?
Hans and Sophie and Christoph were tried. They were convicted and they were executed all within hours. So one of the highest ranking judges in the Nazi system, the notorious Judge Roland Freisler, presided over what was a show trial. It was a show trial from start to finish. Freisler was the head of the so-called People's Court, and he himself had pledged to rule as he believed the Führer himself would judge. And so he was very wrapped up in the Nazi regime. You just saw a picture of Freisler giving the Nazi salute at a later trial when he would preside over the case of the men who would attempt to assassinate Hitler. Tickets to the trial of the Schoells and Christoph Probst were given to high-ranking Nazis so that they could come and witness this show trial. And the friends were found guilty. They were found guilty of defaming the Führer, giving aid to the enemy of the Reich, and weakening the armed security of the nation. And all three were beheaded, one by one, in a matter of minutes. Sophie at 5 p.m., Hans at 5:02, Christoph right after that. And in an additional bit of cruelty, we believe that the Germans actually billed the families for the cost to transport the body and the head, which was a typical practice following an execution at Stadelheim prison.
So extraordinarily brutal, but clearly done for propaganda purposes, designed to intimidate anyone else who might join in this kind of dissent. Becky, we have a question from a viewer named David who asks, why were the Schoells executed when, according to Holocaust scholar Christopher Browning, German military personnel who refused to participate in killing were allowed to sit out in peace? And if I could kind of extend his question, we do see unevenness in the kind of penalties for different types of resistance. This trial of the White Rose members did not take place in isolation. What else was happening in Germany at this time which could account for the severity of their sentence?
Yeah, I think there is a big difference here. One is people committing treason, and that is what the Schoells and Christoph Probst were accused and convicted of. Their trial and the executions were held on February 22nd, 1943, so 79 years ago today. And the trial took place only 4 days after Hans and Sophie were arrested. One of the clear and very important points here is that it was clear at this point in February 1943 that the war was not going well for Germany. Only a few weeks earlier, the Battle of Stalingrad had come to an end, and it had ended in a massive German defeat. Over 230,000 German soldiers died in the battle. 91,000 people were captured. The German military had surrendered. And for the first time, this defeat was big enough that Nazi propaganda could not hide it. And so leaders feared that they were going to lose their grip on the German people, and that resistance, like the actions that the White Rose were urging, that kind of resistance might spread. And so the Germans were desperate for any sort of PR victory and a warning to others who might step out of line. So I think one of the differences is this kind of public need to punish the perpetrators, as opposed to the German military, where you're not going to publicly punish someone because you don't want to necessarily draw attention to the mass killings in the Eastern Front.
If I might add, I think David's question also speaks to the fact that there was not always consistency in German policy or in its implementation across different settings. Also, that not all members of the German military were members of the Nazi Party. So there were varying degrees of commitment to the campaign of genocide, and some superior officers made decisions that they couldn't risk mutiny from their whole group, and it was maybe easier or more strategic to let someone walk away. So thank you, David. It's a very, very complex question, and also a reminder, though, that people had agency and that there were opportunities to make different choices. Becky, as you've just described for us, Hans, Sophie, Christoph, they were convenient scapegoats because additionally, if someone like them could be blamed for undermining German morale or the military effort, then Nazi leaders would not be as responsible for the downward spiral that the country was facing. But there's a comment from a viewer named Robert. He writes, "There was more resistance to the Nazis than I realized, but the groups were rarely aware of other resistance groups and their actions were not coordinated." Is that an accurate assessment, Becky, or to what degree were people in touch with each other?
I mean, I think Robert's right that there was more resistance to the Nazis than some people realized. But also, Hans had actually arranged to meet with members of another like-minded resistance group. Again, this was part of their ramping up of their efforts. And the meeting was supposed to be in late February 1943. So when Hans didn't show up, the plans fell through, and the other resistance leaders then learned that Hans had been arrested and executed.
And I think, we can also look at the White Rose and think that it was an effort to kind of draw like-minded people out from the shadows, to make them feel like there are more than you realize, more others than you realize, and that perhaps it would make people bolder. But over the course of the next year, about 20 members of the White Rose were convicted of crimes. Several others were sentenced to death, including Alexander, the Russian-speaking friend, and Professor Huber. A viewer named Vojislav, writing from Bosnia-Herzegovina, has written to say that Alexander Schmorell was later canonized by the Russian Orthodox Church in 2012. And I think that kind of recognition, that kind of adulation and admiration for Alexander shows the way that the story of the White Rose has captured the imagination of many, many people. They were idealistic young people who were murdered for speaking truth to power. But one can say, what did they really accomplish? They took a lot of risk, but is it measurable? And another viewer named Joan is asking, as we look back on this heroic movement, is there any way to determine the influence that it had on the German people? What do you say to that, Becky?
Well, I mean, what the White Rose wanted was a groundswell. They wanted people to rise up. And as you said, they wanted to pull people out of the shadows. I mean, that was the goal of the leaflets. That was the goal of the writing on the walls. And that didn't happen. Germans did not rise up en masse. And I think that's not so unusual or surprising. When we think about resistance movements today, those who are doing the hard work of trying to create change, they often feel like they're not being heard. It doesn't mean that their resistance isn't worthy. It just means that it is very difficult to get people to rise up against an oppressive system.
So as a follow-up, another viewer named Neurin writes to ask, why weren't there more people like the White Rose and these students in Germany? After the war, Becky, I know that some Germans came to embrace the White Rose posthumously, but there are some kind of complicated motivations there, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the White Rose is an appealing story for a lot of people. At the end of World War II, the Allies, the nations at war with Germany, they wanted to believe that the White Rose represented this real Germany and that the German people had been powerless to oppose the Nazis. And we know that that's not true. But also in Germany after the war, Germans too wanted to believe that the White Rose members represented them, that average Germans had opposed Hitler the whole time, and that the Nazi leadership were the only guilty ones. But of course, that's a myth. While there were a few people who resisted, many other Germans collaborated with the Nazis, many were complicit, many just looked the other way. And so the White Rose, in fact, is really just a heartbreaking story of university students who tried to lead, but nobody was following them.
On Facebook, a woman named Maura writes, imagine if the majority of Germans had stood against Hitler instead of being complicit. And, I think that's a very, very understandable impulse. And in fact, the White Rose, it provides us some solace in what is a very troubling, dark history. But the true history is much, much less comfortable than that. Becky, as we get ready to close, today some White Rose members have become almost like cult heroes of resistance. They are celebrated in so many ways. Could you describe for us some of the ways that they are used as a source of inspiration?
Yeah, the members of the White Rose are held up as role models. There are postage stamps in their honor, like this one here. There are productions about the White Rose, including a recent PBS program in Germany about Sophie, and even contemporary artwork. You can see this graffiti here in Munich, and it reminds us of how young they all were, Hans and Sophie in particular, as well as other members of the White Rose, when they spoke out about against the Nazis and when they started their resistance movement. And I imagine that members of the Schoell family and members of the White Rose probably take great pride in this. They probably take great pride that, and they should, that this young rebellion continues to inspire people today.
And it clearly does. We heard online from several teachers whose students have been inspired by the White Rose. Among them is Allison, who wrote, "We are studying people who stood up for what is right, no matter the personal cost." Another educator, Laura, in Columbia, Missouri, who has taught high school for 3 decades. She says that her students came through their research and writing so inspired. May we never forget. And I pray that schools continue to teach history. And we heard from art teacher Mark Nelson and his students at Central Junior High in Kewanee, Illinois, that I mentioned earlier, who shared a collage of artwork created by his students after they studied about the White Rose. And Mr. Nelson described how for his students, these young members members of resistance offer an inspiring glimpse of light in such a dark period of inaction by so many German civilians. So clearly, great resonance, great power, even so many decades after their execution. So Becky, thank you very much for joining us today to help us understand some of the more complicated history behind the mythology. It's always good to speak with you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Edna.
And I think when we're looking at the White Rose, it can be tempting to say they didn't accomplish very much on a practical level. But we will never actually know to what degree their leaflets inspired others, what small actions people might have taken, actions of compassion, actions of sabotage, simply by knowing that they were not alone in their feelings of unease or anger against the regime. I think the other thing that we can take away from the White Rose is the sense that there is strength in numbers, that when individuals who have conviction come together, that they have greater strength in a show of unity. So nearly 80 years later, the White Rose continues to inspire people, and they're remembered as symbols both of defiance, but also of idealism. If the story that we shared today of the White Rose spoke to you, we hope that you will follow our museum on Facebook and also on Instagram and Twitter to learn more about Holocaust history and the context around stories like these. We also hope that you'll be back with us on Tuesday, March 1st, where we will commemorate Women's History Month with a replay of one of our favorite episodes, The Spies They Never Saw Coming. Learn how female spies, including Black American performer Josephine Baker, exploited low expectations of women to camouflage their espionage activities during World War II. Until then, wherever you're watching, be safe and well. Bye-bye.